Hello, and welcome to
Small talk about the big issue.
I'm Lorraine.
And I'm Kiara. So today, after closing off our last episode on the environmental cost of electronic devices, we're moving back towards the living, something that's actually surrounding us all the time without most of us being really aware of it. And we're going to travel to a very, very small scale. We're going to explore the microscopic world of microbes. We're very excited to have you back here for our 8th episode.
We are, and we're going to try to answer the following question. Is our future microbial? Does the fight against climate change involve us using microbes in new, or perhaps not so new, ways?
So I'll start off this episode by answering very common questions, which I think are quite important to start off on the right foot. First of all, what are microbes? And more particularly, what are their properties that can help us build a more sustainable future?
That sounds very interesting. And then I will build on that to discuss microbes in food and how maybe microbes are the key to having more sustainable diets.
I'm really excited about learning about that because I know that it's something that you've been quite fascinated by for a while. So I had a few sneak peeks into data that you've collected these past few years, and I'm excited to see what you're going to teach us today.
We should say the idea for this episode was prompted by a sort of open address in Nature, which is one of the most recognized scientific journals, published by a group of scientists, urging the world, investors, consumers to show more interest in microbial science because of all that it has to offer in fighting climate change. And so that was the idea behind this episode.
Do you know when it was published?
Good question. It was published in November of 2024 by a group of scientists from all over the world, really. There are people from Australia, from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, from North America. So it's really this global scientific appeal to pay more attention to microbes and to invest more in them.
Okay, so I guess we're doing the right thing with this episode. I'm excited to see where it will take us.
Yes, so am I.
Let's start at the beginning, maybe by clarifying what a microbe is, because we keep hearing about them in different contexts, but I'm not sure everyone knows precisely what can be defined as a microbe. So let's look at the etymology of the word as we like to do it. It comes from the Greek, micros and bios, which means little, life. And funnily enough, a microbe stands for micro-organism in English, which means a small organism. So little life again.
How poetic.
So what does this tell us? Microbes are microscopic organisms, which means organisms that you can only observe through a microscope. They're so small, so tiny that you couldn't see them with your bare eyes. And I know you've heard about microbes before, and I'm sure it wasn't always in a very positive context, because typically microbes don't have a good reputation.
No, they don't. They're associated to disease.
Absolutely. In French, they definitely don't. I've never heard anyone use the term microbe in French other than in the context of illness or a pandemic or washing your hands and being healthy.
Also, other than maybe related to the human body, I think maybe it's interesting to note there are microbes everywhere, in you, on every surface you touch, but also in the ground, on plants, in the sea. They're ubiquitous, really.
They are. That's the path I wanted to go down because, well, starting kindergarten, I knew that being told you have a lot of microbes was not a good thing. And I want to change the mind of children who might be listening to this, but also to anyone who still thinks microbes are bad.
Okay.
I wanted to put things into perspective. They're actually not that bad. You know, there's 3 trillion species of microbes, of microorganisms on Earth. Could you imagine maybe what fraction of them are actual pathogenic, so that they can cause infectious diseases?
I would say I'd be surprised if it was more than a third.
Okay, so a third of 3 trillion would be 1 trillion.
Yeah.
of infectious microbes. Actually, out of those 3 trillion species of microbes that exist, only 1,400 can cause harm to humans or animals.
Okay, so that was my question. Are we counting infectious diseases in humans, in mammals, in animals, in plants?
All of them.
So that we know of, there are only 1,000
Yeah.
and some microorganisms that cause diseases in other forms of life.
Exactly. There's only 1,400 bad microbes, as we would call them.
Whoa! I think it's time we start talking about the good ones.
Yeah. 3 trillion species of good microbes or neutral microbes, but that we shouldn't worry about too much. That's something to keep in mind, because usually when you think microbes, you want to kill them, you want to get rid of them. And it's important that we do, because some of them are really dangerous for us. But as we try to kill the bad ones, the pathogens, we cannot really differentiate between the good and the bad ones. So usually the good ones also get killed in the process, and we lose a lot of biodiversity. I can give you a very concrete example of this. When you're infected by a bacteria, you will usually take antibiotics, because that's the way to go to get rid of the infection. But by doing so, you also kill the good bacteria, the bacteria in your gut that you spend years collecting.
Maybe you don't kill all of them. I know
No.
there's some antibiotic specificity, but yeah, there are some off-target deaths for sure.
Of course. And sometimes it's okay, but it's also been shown that taking antibiotics as a child can have an effect on your mental health. This is because the microbes in your gut play a really big role in regulating your mental health. So this is very interesting, I think, as a scientist, to get into that world. Yeah.
Yes.
The health of your gut and of the microbes living in there defines the mental health that you have.
Very interesting.
But we want to circle back to the environment. This was just an example to show that microbes help us. We have a very symbiotic relationship with them, especially those that are on our skin, in our gut, inside of our bodies. Maybe I should define what a symbiosis is, and especially what mutualism is. Mutualism is what happens when 2 organisms have a long-lasting, positive, close relationship that benefits them both. So this is the case for the microbes in our guts. We provide them with a good environment, we provide them with nutrients, we provide them with moisture, and they, in turn, either protect us from bacteria, but they can also break down a lot of the food we eat. Actually, it's been shown that our microbes in our gut facilitate the absorption of 10% of the calories we eat.
Oh,
Because our body's not really good at digesting carbohydrates, for example.
really?
And thankfully, we have microbes in our guts which do that for us in exchange for a place to live. And this is the kind of interaction that you would describe as mutualism. There's mutual benefits in that relationship.
I think if we try and give maybe not an overview, but a couple other examples of mutualism with microbes, coral reefs are
Absolutely.
hugely reliant on microscopic algae. And so the bleaching events that we talk about on the news are driven by increases in temperature that make these mutualistic interactions deteriorate and the algae leave the coral.
It's really funny, Lorraine, because this was going to be my
I'm
next
sorry
point.
for spoiling.
I wanted to, no, it's okay, it's okay. I wanted to step out of the human body because, I mean, there's a lot of examples that show that microbes are very helpful to us. But taking a step back, they also are crucial parts of ecosystems. So you mentioned corals, for example, the way that they perform photosynthesis and in turn help corals build their calcium spine, their calcium skeleton. And they also fix the carbon that is necessary to feed the coral through photosynthesis. And also not to forget the absolute star of the show, which are the cyanobacteria, which millions of years ago turned our atmosphere into a breathable space for plants and animals.
You know what I found out recently? This is a total fun fact. The color of the sky is a result of early photosynthesis. Without the concentrations of oxygen that we have in the atmosphere, you know how in the first episode we said that initially, or I think this was the first episode, like O2 concentrations in the atmosphere were a lot lower because oxygen is released as the kind of waste product of photosynthesis.
Yeah.
And that turned the sky blue. Before it was much grayer.
I can be thankful for that too, because I do love a blue sky.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this was just a short introduction to maybe help you see microbes in a new light, not just from the perspective of diseases, but also from the things that they provide for us, and
Mm-hmm.
to maybe learn to value their contributions to our world. Moving on, I wanted to maybe go through the very cool characteristics of microbes and how they can be of use to us to tackle some sustainability goals.
Okay, very interesting.
What's also very interesting about microorganisms is that they represent 99% of all species on Earth, which means that they're the most diverse types of organisms on Earth. That means you can also find them everywhere. They've adapted to countless environments and divided into countless species, which explains why there's so many more species of microorganisms, or microbes as we call them here, than plants or animals. So as Lorraine started saying, you can find them everywhere. You can find them in your guts. I've read a statistics that said that for each cell in your body, you had 10 microbes in your body. I think this number has been toned down a little bit recently, but that's just crazy. The microbes outnumber your own cells in your body in a very helpful way. So you can find them on our bodies, but you can also find them in extreme conditions and deep trenches in the ocean, in boiling water, and acidic volcanoes. And so they have to have an extreme genetic diversity to face all of these extremes. And it's thanks to those very special traits that we can find adaptations to deal with a warming future and especially build a sustainable future for us and for life on Earth. So as I did research on how microbes can help us achieve sustainable development goals, of course, the first thing I stumbled upon was how they can prevent infections and strengthen our immune system and all the ways that they can make humans healthier. So this is all very good. And we also discussed it a little bit in the beginning of this episode. But I wanted to focus a bit more on an ecological perspective and the ways that microbes can help us tackle some parts of the climate change crisis. The first thing that I came across was that bacteria can actually help us with recycling. I don't know if you'd ever heard of this.
Some aspects of it, but I'm very curious. Please go on.
Well, in general, microbes are really good at breaking things down. That's usually called decomposition, usually done by bacteria or fungi. And what they do when they decompose is that they use up organic matter and turn it into smaller molecules, which then are easier to spread or to reuse.
Does it necessarily have to be dead organic matter?
It's not only organic matter, it can also be toxic compounds, plastic even.
Okay.
So actually there's microbes that have been found to be able to digest plastic into smaller compounds. So they just digest the PET plastic to make smaller molecules, which then can be reused and recycled. So it's really crazy that we can just repurpose bacteria to get rid of one of the most prominent wastes of our times.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one way in which microbes can help us recycle and deal with our waste. They can do that with biological matter, but also plastic, and interestingly, also toxic compounds. So some of them are not bothered by breaking down heavy metals and releasing them under the form of less harmful compounds. Which leads me to my next point, is that bacteria can be used to depollute environments. They can help remove, detoxify, break down, or even extract contaminants. So those can be plastics, but also pesticides, any kind of toxic waste that has been dumped in the environment. Microbes can be used to break these down into smaller parts that aren't as harmful to the environment as the initial product. This is something called bioremediation. It's the concept that life forms, such as microbes, can actually take a big part in us making environments clean again.
I'm working on this at the moment, funnily enough.
You are?
Yeah.
Oh,
My master's project, it's indirectly linked to what you've just talked about.
interesting.
Uh-huh.
One example of this would be wastewater treatment. They actually use microbes in most wastewater plants to digest organic matter, fats, food waste, and what they release instead is carbon dioxide, water, and some more biomass, which can be really helpful in also extracting heavy metals from the water before releasing it into rivers, because keeping those heavy metals would actually cause a lot of mortality
Mm-hmm.
for any actual living organism in those rivers.
heavy metals for context, where the most famous ones are things like arsenic, lead, things you really don't want to be eating or drinking.
Definitely not, yeah. As a painter, I know that my paint, for example, usually contains a lot of cadmium as well, which is known to be a very toxic heavy metal. So yeah, be careful with what you use, how you use them, and never dispose of them in nature or without knowing where your water will go once it holds these heavy metals. Another top of my mind example of those bacteria which help cleaning up the environment would be the oil-eating bacteria that can be used during oil spills. How amazing is that?
I know.
A bacteria will just start digesting the oil and cleaning the ocean after our human mistake. I've also grown up knowing that mushrooms, fungi in general, are really good at extracting heavy metals from the soil. We might have to fact check this, but my parents always told me that it was unsafe to eat mushrooms after nuclear events, or like, the Chernobyl accident made it really unsafe to eat mushrooms for a while in Europe because of the radioactivity, which was usually absorbed by mushrooms.
I feel like I've heard this too. Something for the fact check.
So if you want to find out, stay until the end, because the fact check is usually a very interesting time where we go back on what we said and make sure that we only provide you with very strong and reliable facts.
Backed by robust science.
So this is one way in which bacteria, or in general microbes, can help us live in a cleaner, more sustainable world. I have to say, of course, these are situations in which microbes clean up our mess. The point would, of course, be to have less of these messes, less oil spillage, less pollution in general, less heavy metals in nature. I'm just saying that these are technologies that would be interesting to look at for those accidents that are bound to happen. But of course, we want to reduce the number of these accidents.
A good point to make.
This will also be the case with the next point, where I found out that microbes can also help us produce clean energy. I mean, how cool is that?
Yes.
So microbes also, not all of them, of course, but some microbes have the very cool ability of turning organic matter into biofuel. So there's many different ways of achieving that, actually. There's a lot of different groups of microbes who can do that with different types of organic matter and producing different types of fuel, which still needs to be heavily investigated and invested into. But there's been some very strong cases, very strong examples of this working and this being, commercialized.
Okay.
I remember students in my bachelor using yeast to make ethanol from sugar or starch. I don't know how simple of an experiment it is, but I knew that it was possible to do it in the matter of a few weeks as a science bachelor student.
Okay.
But it's also been shown that microalgae can be turned into biodiesel, and many other countless examples of microbes turning organic matter into clean energy that doesn't release as much CO2 as our traditional oil drillage and refinery. So that is definitely something I'm excited about, because it's something we can be very proactive about. We know what to do to stop the climate change crisis, but at the same time, we also need to transition towards clean energy sources. So any advancement in that domain is exciting. Although we already have great solutions with wind power, hydropower, and solar power, it's always interesting to find these new solutions which could really help us reduce our carbon emissions.
I agree with you that these microbial solutions make me very kind of enthusiastic and hopeful, and it's really cool in a perhaps slightly nerdy kind of way to think of everything we can do. But biofuels is one of the things that I think is maybe worth mentioning an asterisk on it, because if I'm not a biofuel expert, but we'd still be burning organic matter, and that would still be releasing greenhouse gases.
You're correct. It's definitely not the right solution we're looking for. It's a very interesting alternative to traditional fuel.
Absolutely.
In the sense that it emits a lot less carbon into our atmosphere. So it could be a transition away from fossil fuel, but it is not the end result that we want to strive for. It still releases too much carbon, because the only thing we can do to stop climate change right now is not even to reduce our emissions of CO2, but is to release a net zero of CO2 in a year.
It's within this context that I had some qualms about biofuel.
But you're right to voice them, and I'm glad we clarified it.
And it does limit the damage that we inflict on the environment in terms of extracting traditional oil, for example.
That is true. So far we've seen that microbes can help us recycle, microbes can help us clean up polluted environments, but they can also be a tool in producing cleaner energy. What's also been shown, there's a lot of research ongoing on how bacteria can actually store carbon from our atmosphere and actually even produce electricity. It's very, very interesting for sure, but it doesn't take away from the fact that as much as it's crucial to have less CO2 in our atmosphere, the focus right now should be on putting less in instead of how to remove as much as we can, because it's been shown also that as soon as we will stop emitting CO2, we will see the effects straight away, and the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases will slowly start to decline as well. So as long as we keep emitting as much as we do now, there is little point in thinking that just capturing or storing the carbon we've released is the way to go, is the solution that will stop global warming and climate change induced by the burning of fossil fuels.
I think what we're trying to say is when it comes to using microbes to make energy or to capture carbon, that it's really exciting technology and very promising to fight against climate change, but it's not a silver bullet. And really what we need to focus on is just emitting less carbon rather than burning cleaner, quote unquote, carbon or capturing carbon so that we can then release more.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. That's it in a nutshell. So the last point that I came across while doing this research on how microbial technologies can help us build a more sustainable future, I saw something about food production. I was really excited to read into it, but I decided to leave it up to Lorraine to explain it to us how microbes can help us in that department, which is very critical in the sense that, as I said in the last episode, the world's population is supposed to increase by 25% until 2050. So that's quite a lot of people to feed, and it's definitely a challenge that we will need to own up to.
Okay, that's a very smooth transition into the article that I wanted to talk about. And I was quite intentional with the theme of the article for reasons that we've kind of discussed already, where I knew a little bit about the power of microbes in helping us fight climate change, but I was quite keen to talk about using microbes in a way that will help us live sustainable lifestyles in a way that requires behavioral change from us. So we were talking about biodiesels earlier, and they're really good because potentially they're going to be releasing less carbon. But fundamentally, they would still allow us to have societies and transport systems that rely a lot on burning diesel. So that wouldn't really elicit a behavioral change. But I think microbes in food are interesting because, and I'm slowly hinting at them, I wanted to discuss something where we would have to change our habits a bit more. And microbes would help us do that. Does that make sense?
I'm hooked. Yeah, I really want to know how you got to this point. Yeah.
So in other words, I'd like to talk about eating microbes. Now, I was wondering what people's instinctive reaction would be when I said, okay, let's start eating microbes. So what's yours, Kiara? How do you feel?
I'm thinking that I might be hungry, Microbes are these tiny microscopic things. I wouldn't get full from them,
Okay. Your concern would be hunger.
That's my first thought.
Okay.
Yeah, because microbe for me is really micro-organism. It's a tiny, tiny thing. If you tell me eat microbes, I'll look around and I'll just be confused. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that I might have been eating microbes all along.
That's kind of the point that I wanted to make, is that if you've had bread, yogurt, cheese, wine, beer in your life ever, you've relied on foods that not just have microbes in them, but fundamentally use microbes to get to that end result. And so, yeah, really, we've been eating microbes all along.
It's a form of domestication, actually. Humans have not only domesticated animals or plants for crop production or meat production, they've also domesticated bacteria or microbes for fermentation or even for cheese production. I had to do this very interesting project on blue cheese, for example.
I know what you're going to say.
And, well, the way this happens is that, one day there's this fungi that just happens to drift and land on top of a cheese culture. And then this cheese turned out to be blue, and now we have blue cheese. And, of course, humans knowingly selected this strand over and over again. They saw this blue cheese, tasted it, liked it. And so they kept taking a little bit of that cheese, putting it into new milk, creating more of that cheese. And that's how you pass down this fungus that got kind of incorporated into the cheese, and how you domesticate a strain of what used to be a wild fungus, what turned out to be now a cheese-making fungus.
Oh, this is super interesting. I never thought of microbes as being domesticated. Yeah, but I suppose that fits all the criteria for what we call domestication. So in terms of, maybe I'll quickly address your fear of being hungry and say that one of the characteristics of microbes is that they grow really fast and they can amass biomass very fast. And I think that's one of the things that makes them really interesting for pretty much everything we use them for biofuel, for potentially food, is that we can get a lot of them in a very short amount of time. So fear not about being hungry.
Thank you.
So the specific niche of food science that I wanted to talk about is using microbes for protein.
Okay.
And this is really interesting from both a human and environmental health perspective, because there are issues with how we produce and consume protein today, especially in a westernized diet. Now, just to give you some quick stats, the global food system right now is responsible for about a third of the global greenhouse gases emissions. And a huge contributor of that is our production of livestock, so animals that we raise to eat them.
Okay. That's a lot, that 1/3 of our emissions are due to food production.
If you think about everything that we need to grow, all the animals, and I'll get into that right now, all the transport that's involved in the food system, I think it adds up to a huge amount. Food is something all 7 or 8 billion of us consume on a daily basis.
Yeah, so there really are some important changes to make when it comes to our food consumption behavior if we want to tackle climate change.
Yes, and identifying the foods that release most greenhouse gases. And the major culprits are ruminants. Ruminants are animals like cattle, sheep, goat, buffaloes, and they have this digestive system that releases a lot of methane. Now, methane is a gas that we've talked about before, and you had used this analogy that I really liked of greenhouse gases like a blanket.
Yeah.
And methane is kind of like that thermal layer that you wear in the winter. That like base layer that's thin but really warm.
Yeah.
And methane is like that. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. So even a small concentration in the atmosphere will warm the earth quite significantly. So we really need to reduce our methane emission, and our ruminant production and consumption contributes a whole lot of methane.
Does that also include dairy production?
Yes, cows that we raise for dairy also release methane. I don't know what the trade-off is in terms of the sustainability of raising a cow for dairy as opposed to a cow for meat exactly. Some other issues with consuming large amounts of animal-based proteins is that you need a lot of land, a lot of water. And that means that we're often transforming natural wild environments into pastures, for example.
So an ideal food system would require less land, but also release less greenhouse gases.
Exactly. And that's where microbial proteins come in. And maybe now's a good time to define what a microbial protein is. So the production of microbial protein relies on bacteria, yeast, fungi, or microalgae, which have the ability to convert simple carbon sources, like sugar, for example, into more complex molecules like protein through their metabolism.
Yeah.
And we can use these proteins to imitate meat, both in texture and in taste.
Okay.
And they're really good at it. The protein content of these microorganisms can range from 30 to 80%. So you're getting really high yields, high protein content.
Do they produce exactly the same types of protein?
If you compare them in terms of digestibility and amino acid content, so amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, they're comparable to beef.
Okay. And so just on a very visual scale, where is the culture? How does it grow? What does it look like in the end? Will you be eating mushrooms that have the same types of protein as beef?
So these microorganisms will be grown in bioreactors through fermentation, so the same process that generates cheese, using sugar as feedstock. So a lot of the commercially available kinds right now use cane sugar as feedstock.
Okay.
And that was actually a point I wanted to make, which is that if you're curious about what they look like, go out into a supermarket and you can get yourself some.
Really?
And the ones that I've seen in my supermarket look like meat, basically.
Oh.
You can get these patties, you can get these steaks, you can get these, I think, chicken nuggets.
Does it explicitly say on the label, grown by microbes?
I don't think I've seen this on the packaging. I think part of the reason is maybe the idea of eating microbes isn't appealing to a lot of people. But I know of one brand, and I can, name drop because we're not sponsored, but Corn, spelled with a Q,
Corn,
is a very widespread and fairly mainstream brand of protein grown from fungi specifically.
Okay. And also just to clarify, you're not eating the product that is released by a microbe. You're actually eating the microorganism itself that contains the protein.
After some processing, yeah.
Yeah, it's not alive anymore, just for anyone being afraid of eating microbes. Okay.
Yeah, it's dead.
Okay. Just like the meat we eat. I mean, it's no different, really. It's just that it's a practice that is a lot less land intensive, water intensive, and carbon intensive.
And interestingly, you can decouple it from the environmental conditions of the place it's being, quote unquote, grown in. Because, there are also plant-based protein alternatives like legumes are superfoods, for example. But even those require certain environmental conditions, a certain amount of rain and sunlight in the place that they're being grown.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is going to be increasingly impacted by climate change. So in that sense, the production of microbial protein is very resilient in the face of climate change. Now, this also means, and this is, introducing some nuance here, that the production of microbial protein requires energy, electricity, for example. So the article that I want to talk about today is called The Projected Environmental Benefits of Replacing Beef with Microbial Protein.
Okay.
And it was published by a group of scientists from Germany, Taiwan, and Sweden in 2022, headed by Florian Humphenode. And it focuses on microbial proteins, specifically the main one that we can make in a commercially viable way today, which is mycoprotein, protein from fungi. So corn, for example. And so what the authors did is that they analyzed the environmental effects of partially substituting ruminant meat with microbial protein between 2020 and 2050.
Okay.
And so they looked at either 0% substitution, 20, 50, or 80% globally by 2050. And so this is not everyone at the snap of a finger switching over to exclusively microbial protein. This is what would happen if by 2050, 0%, 20%, 50%, or 80% of our consumption of beef were replaced by microbial proteins.
Okay, so this was purely modeling, right?
Yes, they used a land use model called MAGPIE, Model of Agricultural Production and its Impact on the Environment. And this model takes into account not just biophysical factors like, climate change and different vegetation types and crop yields and food demand and population growth, but also economic factors like trade. So it's this very holistic way of looking at land use specifically and the effects of land use. And they looked at this within the context of SSP2.
Oh.
Now, this is a throwback to episode 3, I think, where I discussed SSP2, or the different SSPs, which are these shared socioeconomic pathways. And SSP2 is just a framework we have for thinking about what would happen if basically we didn't change too much about how we behave about the environment. We're still trying, but not enough.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Too
It's like
slowly.
kind of staying on this trajectory.
With greenhouse gas emissions still increasing.
Yeah. And so what they found is if we did not substitute any of our ruminant consumption with microbial protein, cropland and pasture would both increase at the expense of natural environments like forests, for example, between 2020 and 2050. That would amount to, by the year 2050, 8.4 million hectares per year deforested.
Okay.
And close to 5.5 million tons of CO2 per year being emitted in 2050.
And both of these things we can't really afford, can we?
Certainly not. Now let's look at what happens if we substitute 20% of our ruminant consumption with microbial protein. That would have the global annual deforestation rates by 2050. So substituting just 20% would have that big of an impact. It would also more than have the net global CO2 emissions.
That's incredible. And I believe that if more people knew that, they wouldn't hesitate before switching to that alternative at least 20% of the time.
I know. This isn't like fully cutting out beef. This is just occasionally having something else that's equally healthy, equally nutritious.
And probably just as tasty. Yeah.
Now, what happens if we're even more ambitious? Now, let's just skip over to if we substitute 80% of our ruminant meat consumption with microbial protein. At that point, we would be looking at less than 1 million hectares per year deforested in 2050. Just a quick reminder, if we don't substitute any of our ruminant consumption, we're looking at 8.4 million hectares per year.
Okay.
Switching 80% of our ruminant meat consumption would also lead to 85% reduction in CO2 emissions. So a huge win.
Which is exactly what we need. We need strong solutions to help us transition to carbon-free societies.
Exactly. And so hopefully this article gives us a beginning of an answer that, okay, maybe when it comes to food, microbes can be the future and they can feed all of us in a sustainable way. Now, I want to introduce some nuance here because this is a fairly new way we have of producing food. And there's a lot of exciting developments. But right now, for example, the protein that's produced requires sugarcane. Sugarcane is grown only in certain parts of the world, notably mostly tropical areas. And it's being perfected in the direction of, okay, what else is a carbon source? CO2. What if we could grow our food on CO2 and kill two birds with one stone, basically?
That sounds like a utopia. Hopefully the one we're headed for.
Yes, hopefully.
Yeah. But have they seen results so far?
I think it's been possible, just not at a scale that's commercially viable now.
Okay.
Maybe this is something for the fact check.
Yeah. It would definitely be exciting to find out that it has been made possible.
Yes. So on a concluding note, if there's a resource that I would recommend for this episode would be to try out some microbial protein in your next grocery shop. But there's also, if you're interested in how you can have a more sustainable diet, there's an Eat Lancelet Commission initiative called the Planetary Health Diet. And they outline the kind of conditions and requirements for eating as sustainably as possible.
Yeah.
And they have a podcast too. So if you're
Oh.
into podcasts, go and listen. But yeah, I find it very interesting because food is the one thing all of us do every day. And it's really, if I look at what I consume, the share of my expenses that food represents, I think it's an aspect of our lives that we can really act on to be more sustainable.
Absolutely. Especially knowing now that food production worldwide accounts for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. That's something that really has to stop if we want to live in a world sub 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming.
Yeah. Okay, we learned lots this episode.
Absolutely.
You started by making a really strong argument for why we need to think of microbes as friends and allies, as opposed to things that are always out to get us.
Absolutely. And I feel like your article, Lorraine, really opened my eyes on the solutions that are right in our reach. Of course, I mean, the fact that I haven't seen a single corn product in France is making me a little bit sad. But at the same time, it's also a good reminder that it's important to invest in such initiatives. These things cannot grow and expand and take up the space in society that they should have given the climate crisis, unless we as a society, as individuals, start investing in it. We can consciously make choices as consumers that favor products that we stand behind morally and also in the midst of a climate crisis. Our choices matter, and I hope that's something that you can always take away from our podcast, is that you as an individual have the position, have the power to make decisions that matter. And investing into alternative food sources that aren't as carbon intensive, land intensive, water intensive also helps perfecting these processes, perfecting these products, and making them more readily available for a bigger part of the population.
Vote with your money. What you said just reminded me, actually. So I heard of corn when I saw someone from their company, I don't remember the position, speak at a conference at my university.
Oh.
And this person made a really interesting point, and they were coming at it kind of from what you've just discussed, like how can we make these microbial protein products more attractive to consumers? And one of the points this person had made was that we need to stop thinking of them and naming them as alternative protein, because that means that puts things like beef center stage, and really these microbial proteins will always be second rate.
Of course, yeah.
But if we think of them as microbial proteins or green proteins, for example, that removes that kind of bias. And I think it's a much more accurate way of thinking about the future of food.
Yeah. So let's start by switching in our daily vocabulary alternative protein to green protein. Not meat substitution, but sustainable protein sources. Yeah. Well, so many things that we can take home and actually act on in our personal lives. So thank you, Lorraine, for choosing that article.
Thank you. And thank you for your introduction as well. I think that's a really strong finish. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, we're excited to see you for our next episode. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comment, or feedback, feel free to leave us a comment or send us an email at smalltalk.bigissue@gmail.com. Until then, stay tuned and see you next time. Goodbye! We fact-checked this episode and wanted to clarify a few things. I said that studies used to claim there were 10 microbes for each cell in our body. Our current understanding is that the ratio is actually much closer to 1:1, or 1 trillion human cells for 38 trillion microbial ones. I also briefly mentioned the concept of bioremediation, but I thought it was important to mention its Oxford English Dictionary definition. Bioremediation is the use of living organisms to clean up oil spills or remove pollutants from soil, groundwater, or wastewater. Certain fungi are indeed able to concentrate heavy metals and could be used for bioremediation of contaminated wastewater, for example. Mushroom picking after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster was hazardous because mushrooms can accumulate certain radioactive elements. Lorraine defined livestock as animals we raise to eat. This isn't quite accurate. The Cambridge Dictionary definition is animals kept on a farm, such as cows, sheep, chickens, and pigs. Finally, we're happy to report that protein has already been made from algae and other microbes using CO2 as a main carbon source. That's it for this week. See you next time.